With Father's Day fast approaching, we want to put the focus on dads. Fathers, however, are sometimes portrayed in the media as being a little bit goofy and sometimes not very bright. That doesn't sit well with a lot of us fathers who really love and care for our families. Fatherhood is very important in today's society. Joining me now to discuss this a little bit further is retired Lethbridge pastor Abe Block. Abe, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So what do you think of the media's portrayal of dads being so goofy and not very bright on television? Isn't that disrespectful?
Well, the interesting thing to me is on television, they either portray you as a Sylvester Stallone or a Dagwood. We have the two extremes. We don't find the average man portrayed on television. And I don't quite understand. You're either macho or you're nothing. And I think it's sad, really sad.
It is sad. Now, there's a term called a father wound. I mean, fathers make mistakes, and these can leave lasting hurts in their children, can't they? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that the fathers have a leading role in the home. And that leading role gives the children security or non-security.
Structure as well?
Gives the children focus or non-focus, purpose or non-purpose. And the father has a leading role in that. And so often, because of our jobs as fathers, we're always gone. And I think that's one of the problems. I think another problem is that we as dads have had a difficult time finding out who we are. I think it's changing in our generation now. I know my son, for example, doesn't have quite that perceptive that I had. But I have a good, Jamie Buckingham, who writes articles, and he wrote an article about Father's Day, and this is what he says to men in my generation. We're pretty tough customers. We don't cry. We don't get scared. We have answers for every question there is, and even answers for some questions that aren't there. My football coach taught me to hit and hit hard. If I whimpered when I got hit, I ran laps. My military instructor kicked the guys who cried and ridiculed the ones who showed mercy. My supervisor on my first day job after college taught me, stick it to them before they stick it to you. We have been raised in that kind of a mentality. That doesn't bode well for teaching and equipping our children to be gentle and gracious and kind and loving and all that kind of stuff.
So do fathers have to be more nurturing, perhaps? Especially those who become stay-at-home dads. Let's say mom is the career woman. She's a lawyer, a doctor, or whatever. She's working at a business person, works outside of the house, and dad has to stay home.
I give a lot of credit to those dads that stay home and do that. I'm not saying that that's what I would do, but that's not the point. But I think all of us as dads need to get away from this macho image in my generation. I think the generation nowadays, that's changing somewhat. But still, our television portrayals are not that healthy. And I would challenge that.
You know, my father used to say, listen, kid, if you fall out of that tree and break your leg, don't come running to me. Right? That was my dad, right? It's like, wait, what, Dad? Okay, let's talk a bit more about the father being a disciplinarian, more so than the mother. How important is that today, perhaps creating that structure for the kids to grow up in?
Well, that is if the dad's around. If the dad's not around, he can hardly be the disciplinarian. I traveled for many years with the Messengers Quartet, and so my wife was home anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks at a time alone. Well, if she wasn't going to be the disciplinarian, and she wasn't one, the problem was when I came home, I told her, I said, I don't want to hear any stories the first day and a half, none, because I don't want to be seen as the disciplinarian in the home. This is a joint effort. And what children will do is they'll come and try and pit one parent against the other.
Oh, that's true.
And parents need to talk about those kinds of things. And, you know, before you make a dramatic decision, I got to talk to dad or I got to talk to mom, just to make sure that they're on the same page. But you see, if I can share an experience, my dad was a pastor and a preacher and all of that kind of stuff. 5 days a week, every supper time, we had a 20 minute to half an hour devotional, where he taught us. And I think a lot of dads are negating that part, not only the discipline part, but that part. And there needs to be unity in that. And
so being a spiritual leader in the house is important.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So Abe, how important is it to say to your children, I love you and I'm proud of you?
I think it's incredibly important. You see, along with the whole idea of discipline is also the support. The discipline needs to be there. See, sometimes we get the idea that just love and everything else goes away. No, you need that and you need the discipline. And I have worked a lot with young people in my early years as a pastor. And there were three things that I heard youth tell me all the time. I've never heard my dad say, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. I've never heard my dad say, I love you. I've never heard my dad say, I was wrong. You see, and we sometimes think that we as men, when we say those things, then we're not being the macho man. Then we're not being the kind of a guy that we should be. No, that's a relational thing. And we have to have a relationship with our kids. If we can't have a relationship with our kids.
Is a lot of it pride, though, most of the time? The fathers say, you know what, I don't want to admit I'm wrong because Dad always knows what's right. That's what he's thinking in his mindset, perhaps?
I think a lot of it's pride, but if I go back to what I said before, I think a lot of it is how we've been trained. For example, I've talked to a lot of young fathers who don't have a clue how to be a dad. Why? Because they've never seen it from their own father. They've never been taught from their own father. They've never had that kind of relationship with their own father. They walk into this marriage thing, that's one thing. But then they walk into a family and have children. That's a total other thing.
So what do you say to a new father then? How do they get started? Like there's no owner's manual about being a father, right? No parenthood manual. Some have tried to write it over the years, not successfully, mind you, because every kid is different, every child is different. But what advice would you give to that new father?
I think we do have a manual. It's called the Bible. And in John 13:17, for example, it says, you know these things, now do them. What's one way to start? I think a lot of dads know more than what they give in for. We don't necessarily need handles. We need a relationship. God said in his word, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Who's my closest neighbor? My family. And so if I look through the Bible and find out what God teaches me, I need to pass that along. And I will have that proper relationship.
How important is it, Abe, to spend quality time with our children, investing in our kids?
Well, like I said before, my dad had a Bible study 5 days a week at supper time. I wonder how many dads...
But outside of the Bible study, I'm talking about playing catch, maybe cooking together, just, having your child unburden themselves to you, right?
Well, I think that's very important. You have to have a relationship. And the playing catch and all that kind of stuff, I think that's very important. But to me, it's still a little secondary. I'll tell you why. I had a young couple that I was counseling over one time, and I just asked them point blank. I said, when I say dad to you, what do you say? And the fellow said, oh, my dad took me to everything. Absolutely everything. He was always there. Very good. Very good. I looked at her. She was quiet for a minute, and then she looked at me and she said, oh, how he loved Jesus. There you go. Oh, how he loved Jesus. I think if that comes out, the rest will come. If we just bank on that and forget this, we need to teach them. Let me read you something out of Hosea. This is what God says. This is the Heavenly Father. I taught Israel. I healed them. I loved them and led them with cords of graciousness. And I lifted the yoke from their neck and I fed them. Wow. That's a load of hay there for any dad to read and say, okay, how can I do that?
That's a great example from our Heavenly Father, right?
Beautiful.
What are the consequences of not fathering, Abe? Like leaving the family dynamic behind altogether, or like you said earlier, somebody who's not there for their kids? Children
are left in a vacuum. And what happens in a vacuum? Something else will come in to fill it. And I think this is why a lot of our children turn to drugs. They're trying to fill a vacuum.
Or gangs.
Or gangs.
Right.
Or any of that kind of stuff. Street stuff, television, whatever games they play. Because what you fill your mind with is who you will eventually become. See, and that's a challenge for dads. For example, I am the product, because of my age, of what I became 40 years ago. And for dads that are 30, 40, and so on in that age group, I would say, you are now becoming what you will be. So if you are becoming a gracious, sensitive, loving, kind father, you're going to be more so when you get to be my age. But if you're, nasty and tough and just all that kind of stuff, you'll be more so, you'll be a nasty, old, grumpy kind of a guy when you get to be my age.
What's the most valuable life lesson that your father taught you?
I guess I'd have to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That was number one. But after that, it came to relationships. He would always say to us kids, and I'll never forget it, kids, talk to me. I can't read your mind. I may not agree with you, but I need to hear what you're saying. And I wonder how many dads are free enough and open enough to say that to their kids. Talk to me, otherwise we're not communicating.
What about gifts for Father's Day? How important is the actual gift? Like, some kids like to make handmade gifts, homemade gifts for their fathers. My dad used to get a kick out of that when I do that, right? Back in the 70s when they used to smoke, he used to make an ashtray for them, right? Out of clay, and, not so much anymore, obviously. But how important are the gifts, and what do they say about our relationship with our dads?
I think those gifts are extremely important if they're done personally. Mm-hmm. And I think to make things for Dad are extremely important. To write a card and express your feelings. My son wasn't so good at writing cards, but my daughters were. I'll tell you, some of the things they wrote in those cards just touched my heart. But I think even more so than that, as I aged, I began to say to my children, I don't want a gift anymore. Give me a memory. Give me something that is a relational memory for me that I can always come back to and that'll stick in my mind. To me, those kinds of things are extremely important. But to me, the biggest thing is a relationship, something personal, a hug, a kiss, that kind of a thing. To me, is a little more important than a gift.
To show that there's value in that relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You mean a lot to them and they mean a lot to you, right?
Yeah.
For your kids.
Yeah.
Where do a lot of dads fall short nowadays in the 21st century, Abe? Many fathers you've spoken to over the years, where are dads falling short today?
I think one thing is the senior dad not having taught their son. I have heard from so many guys when I do marriage counseling, and we talk about personal things, and they just look at me wide-eyed. I didn't know that. I never heard that. My dad never talked about that. See, and that leads me to another thing. Are we as dads open to be challenged by our children and thereby open the door to help them? Do we carry each other's burdens? Galatians says that very clearly. Carry one another's burdens. It's talking about the church, but I say, let's do that in the family. Let's carry each other's burdens. And I think men are falling short in that area. I know in my time, we didn't help much in the kitchen because we were out there, we had our jobs. The women were in here, they had their job. Thankfully, that's changing. And I appreciate men taking more ownership in the home as well, working alongside, because that then leads to also disciplining alongside and sharing alongside and teaching alongside.
What's interesting is I came from a broken home. My parents got divorced when I was the age of 6. And my father, he actually raised me, and he taught me how to cook, how to sew, how to throw a frisbee.
Isn't that great?
How to swim. How to change my oil, change a tire in a car.
Yeah.
So it was interesting that he taught me a lot of the things that normally your mom would teach you, right?
Exactly.
I mean, my mother, years later, she taught me other things as well, but it was fascinating growing up in that household.
Yes.
So what do you think about dynamics like that, where the father's kind of maybe taking on dual roles?
Well, it's interesting. In my relationship with my father, he was my most significant other. It wasn't my mother. Often it is the mother, like you just alluded to. Mm-hmm. But in our case, it was my father. I carry his name. I became a preacher like he was, even though I vowed when I got married to my first wife, I would never be a preacher. So when that invite came, we had to have a discussion and a prayer time together because I promised her I wouldn't do this. But I think it's important for those kind of relationships. incredibly important that the man of the house can communicate with his children.
How important is that relationship with God that helps to influence our relationship with our children, like funneling through?
It's paramount. It's absolutely paramount. Your relationship this way will plateau if your relationship this way isn't where it should be. And consequently, your relationship with God is going to build the relationship that's horizontal. Very definitely.
Retired Pastor Abe Block, thanks again for joining me here in studio today.
My pleasure. I love it.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great Father's Day.